Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining Maru Matchbox webinar, Cultural Context in the Time of COVID. Just as a quick reminder as we start off, everybody is on mute, so if you have a question, you can always ask that in chat. The presentation is going to go for about 40 minutes with some time at the end for questions. My name is Andrew Hahn, and I'm the Managing Director of Technology at Maru Matchbox. And I'm really excited about this webinar today because we have two supersized brains on tap for the presentation. Our first speaker is our Chief Research Officer, Andrew Grenville, who just published a book, incidentally, called Eureka, The Science and Art of Insights. He's going to be discussing how brands are pushing beyond their inherent bias to navigate the rapid cultural shifts that we're experiencing under COVID. And our second speaker is Todd. He's our Chief Innovation Officer and the architect of most of our System 1, System 2 platforms at Maru. He'll be exploring how emotional System 1 approaches can help us close that say-do gap that's so essential to get right today, especially in this cultural environment. Thank you both for joining today. And Andrew, I will kick it over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. We live in interesting times. Things are changing. We've been tracking a statement around COVID-19, which is, I don't think life will ever be the same even after the virus is gone. Now, when we started tracking that back in March, about 50% of people agreed with that. And that's quite striking because that's an admission even from those early days that things are changing and will never be the same. Just recently, we measured that again and have on an ongoing basis. That number has crept up to 76%. So 3/4 of all consumers believe that nothing will ever be the same. And that extends to your brands as well. You know, a brand is inside the consumer's mind. And as the consumer's mind changes, it affects your brand. It's something that you don't have control over, but it's something that's very definitely happening. Brands are being used in different contexts and in different ways. People are trying new brands because maybe they don't have choice. You take what's available. And it means that your brand is being affected by that, because as each person has that experience with your brand, it is written back into their memory and is part of their impression of what your brand is. So if your brand is being used in fretful times, and maybe it's used as a kind of salve, then maybe that's going to be good for your brand. But if your brand is used in fretful times and there are negative associations with it, that certainly can be detrimental to the brand. So, or is your brand being forgotten because patterns and habits have changed? You know, I don't go to the office anymore. So all of the things I used to purchase and all the places I used to go, I just don't anymore. And they're all fading in my memory. One thing that is certain is that your brand is changing. Will we miss the change? And that's a very real risk. We, rightly so, use System 1 and System 2 thinking and build that into our research approaches, which Todd's going to speak to in a minute. And I think we're all very conscious of that in the insights industry, that we need to understand and play to the fact that we think in two different ways, System 1 and System 2. But what we don't give a lot of attention to is how these same biases and heuristics affect our analysis. You know, we're subject to confirmation bias, to tunnel vision, to whizzy-addy, thinking that what you see is all there is. And it's very simple for us to be blinded and to take assumptions about what brands were and assume that things are still very much the same. So for us at this point, it's exceptionally important that we really question the fundamentals, and there will be extra alert in looking for unexpected findings. part of the issue is that we're pattern seekers, right? So as Christopher Hitchens says, humans beings are pattern seeking animals who prefer even a bad theory or a conspiracy theory to no theory at all. When I was working on the book that Andrew Hahn mentioned, I was last summer up at the cottage, and I stepped out, and the stars are incredible up there. They're not near any major town, so there's no light pollution, and there's millions of stars at night. It's truly awe-inspiring. But what I noticed as soon as I started looking was my eyes and my mind were immediately drawn to constellations like the Big Dipper or Orion's Belt. I focused on those because they help me make sense of the sky, and because you're just, you're drawn to a pattern. We are pattern making animals. There's the night sky and the story of constellations. Every single culture around the world has different traditions and stories. Some of them are the same because good stories travel, but most of them are actually quite distinct and quite different in different cultures. But everywhere we've decided that we need to explain some sort of pattern that we're seeing that really has nothing to do with anything. It's just an arrangement of stars, and some of them are brighter than others. It has no inherent meaning, but we by reflex will assign a meaning to it. So let's read these. What do they say? Paris in the spring, once in a lifetime, bird in the hand. No, it doesn't say that. It says Paris in the spring, once in a lifetime, and bird in the hand. We skip over the extra word because we expect this pattern. We expect bird in the hand and once in a lifetime. We will then inadvertently ignore an extra piece of information that doesn't fit the expected pattern. And this really has implications for research we're doing now, looking at our brand, because if things have changed, but we have an expected pattern that we think we see, we could easily skip the equivalent of the extra A and then suddenly not really be on top of what's happening with our brand. We can really be blinded by our assumptions. If you look, there's red spades and black hearts on those cards. This is from a famous experiment in which people were shown decks of cards, which had the regular expected cards in it, but mixed in were things like these red spades and black hearts. And people, for the most part, didn't catch them. They were unable to, or if they did, they had to really stop and think about it. And even then, it is a bit puzzling to look at that four of spades and think it's not a heart. When we have assumptions, we can very easily, again, miss that piece of information. We also fall prey to Wizziati, or what you see is all there is. And I saw a good interview with Daniel Kahneman, who was explaining this bias, which is one he named. And he said, if I tell you that a leader is intelligent and strong, will you have a conclusion about them being a good leader? Well, yeah, most people would say, yeah, of course. Then he said, what if I tell you the third word is corrupt? He pointed out how we didn't wait for that. We just went ahead and concocted a story out of the sparse data that we have, which might be representative, but in that case, not necessarily, and certainly far from complete. Yet it's the tendency of our minds to leap to the conclusion that we know something. And that's very much a danger when things are changing and we don't know how they're changing. It just means we need to be extra vigilant, question ourselves, have multiple hypotheses, and really dig into the unexpected finding. Charles Darwin was famous for writing down, whenever he found an unexpected finding, he would write it down and leave it as an open question in his mind. And the reason he wrote them down as soon as he found them was because he knew that what happens is that people tend to forget information that doesn't fit with their already what they already know. That it's easy to ignore and then entirely forget about the anomalous finding. But it's the anomalous findings that really are typically the source of true discovery and breakthrough. As Darwin wrote, he said, "I've steadfastly endeavored to keep my mind free so as to give up any hypothesis, however much beloved, as soon as facts are shown to be opposed to it." Now, in order to really detect unknown change, you need to adjust the questions that you're asking, right? Because the questions you have asked in the past reflect the old world and the brand as it was. So you could be tracking something and say, well, we're not seeing any, real change in the attributes, but are you actually asking the right questions? Is there something that has changed that your old questionnaire, which was fine for the world pre-COVID, perhaps is not suitable now? So that just calls to us to step back, question our methods, look for anomalies, ask new questions, explore. This is certainly a time for observational work, good qualitative that allows you to have insight into how things might be changing. And then follow that up with the kind of techniques that Todd will speak to that allow you to tap into system one thinking or the unconscious, because that's where a lot of change is going on. Now's the time really to explore. If we wait and see how this shakes out, things will have shifted. That much is certain. But we'll have lost the opportunity to intervene or to make change on our own. If we just wait to see what happens, it will have happened and we will have done nothing about it, and we will have no opportunity to change that. So now is the time to assess what's going on and be able to pivot and affect change. Blink and you'll miss it. Truly, things have happened and things have changed quite a bit in these past few months. As I mentioned earlier, it's gone up to 76% of Americans and Canadians believe that things will never be the same. Things are changing. We need to pay extra attention to the unexpected and things that don't conform with our existing understanding. We really need to be open and to explore. And the time truly is now. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Todd.
Thanks, Andrew. Excellent. What I'm going to walk you through today is three things. First, System 1 tools and how they apply to brand decisions. Second, how they apply to the current COVID landscape. And third, how brands can leverage these System 1 findings. Oops. Sorry about that. So we're so busy asking about what people think that often we don't take the time to understand how people feel. And sometimes we even ignore how they actually behave. Using a holistic framework at Maru Matchbox, we believe that we can help close the say-do gap by engaging customers in the way they make decisions. Consumers tend to feel, then behave, and then think. And when we look at the framework, the majority of when we think, it impacts short-term behavior through the System 2 thought process. While in the System 1 thought process, it really is that long-term behavioral change. And like Andrew said, in these times, a lot of what is really impacting brands and brand decisions is really happening within that System 1 space. We're really having a lot of change to how we feel, and how is that going to impact our long-term behavioral decisions. So using this holistic framework, we're able to understand how consumers are going to engage with our brands. So this first study is a case study showing how implicit data impacts business decisions. And this was for a large entertainment studio. And in the chart on the left-hand side of the slide is the combination of both the system 1 and system 2 thinking in one chart. And if we look at that, we would see that the awesome movie has the greatest proportion of total interest, while the family movie has the least. Using implicit association testing, we're able to parse out the two systems of thinking, and looking at system 1 implicit response and breaking that apart, we can actually see that the order of interest changes. The family movie was actually the most interesting movie. What was of other interest with this particular study was that the magical movie was something that instinctually this entertainment studio was already pursuing. And this data reinforced that decision that they had already made at a gut level. And this studio went forward and is producing the family movie. So we can see that if we just looked at the system 1 and system 2 data together, we would have reached a very different conclusion. And understanding that system 1 implicit response, we actually arrive at a different business decision. The second case study is using visual semiotics. And I'll get in a little more detail about visual semiotics later on. But using visual semiotics, which is the use of images to understand consumers' emotions, we had a sleep aid product, and with a visual of a woman sleeping. And while the consumers took away that it would help them get to sleep, the real emotional component of the sleep aid product was, would you feel awakened and refreshed when you woke up, when you took this product? And so using visual semiotics, we were able to test the creative in a very tactical way in understanding that if we change the imagery to fit with the emotional resonance of the stimuli, that we could change the way that people perceived the product. And just making a visual change within the product increased the volume of the sales of the product by 20% within 6 months. So moving on to the opportunity and COVID, and looking at this from a point of view of brand heroes and villains, we conducted a study, US rep sample, 1,200 completes, understanding how consumers feel about brands and how they're communicating to them, how they would ideally like brands to communicate to them, and which industries in their mindset were already heroes and villains. So I'll get a little deeper about visual semiotics. Visual semiotics is the product that we have at Maru Matchbox. We call it brand emotion, but it can be used at a brand level and it can be used at a very tactical level, like the example I just walked through with the sleep aid product. Visual semiotics is understanding in a very passive way, in a system way, system 1 way, how consumers feel about a particular piece of stimuli. We've got a normative library of 9,000 images that's been developed over the course of 30 years. It was originally developed in the use to understand emotions with nonverbal autistic children. That very analog image set then grew over time and became digitized. Each image within the normative set carries 10 emotional codes, at least 10 emotional codes, and each image is broken into 6 visual structures. A respondent gets a library of 200 images. Each respondent gets a unique set of that 200. And no, you don't have to use all 200 images, but we want to make sure you have a good library to go through. And we asked the respondent to create a collage describing the stimulus, how they feel about the stimulus. And they also go through a secondary exercise of how they feel about the ideal. Taking those collages, we then decode the emotions using both the emotional codes that are already associated with those images, but also across the 6 different structures. Each collage generates about over 1 million data points. And from that, we create both an emotional segment map and what we call the emotional signature. What I'm going to walk you through now is looking at the COVID-19 brand's emotional landscape on how people currently felt that brands were communicating to them and the ideal. And so we have 9 segments within our visual semiotics. These are the 9 segments, and you can see that the current communication feelings and the ideal were both operating within the same segments. Each segment has 8 emotions, which gives us a landscape of 72 emotions. So while looking at it at this 10,000 foot level, the current brand communication and the ideal look like we're in the same space, but actually the individual emotions are different. They're different not only in order of priority, but also in strength and in makeup. So the way we look at this pyramid, which we call the emotional signature, is looking at the base emotion. The base emotion at the bottom, content, and then the number in the middle is the index score, so how much this over-indexes from the normative set. And we see this building, so primary emotion, secondary, tertiary, and working up through and creating that emotional signature. So we can see that while at a segment level, they look like the current and the ideal are operating in the same space, but the individual emotions change in composition and in strength. So currently, brands are communicating well-being and support. So we look at that base emotion of content. If content is providing that sense of well-being, the secondary emotion is supportive and accomplishment and helpful. And that tertiary emotion, and we did this research about the end of April. And so we were still looking at skilled was still a component of COVID, and that brands were coming in. We think about Tesla, we think about Ford. Brands were contributing and building ventilators and coming up with technology, and that skilled component of brands was really in top of mind. And then there was also this element of control. Brands were coming in and taking control while there was a shortfall in what the federal government was doing or what the state government was doing. Brands rallied and began and showed elements of taking control. And then lastly, there was this feeling of sympathetic, that kind, responsive, compassionate feeling. Off on the right side of the chart is some visuals that are actually part of that normative library that represent each one of those emotions. And so as part of understanding about how people feel, here are some of the visuals that people actually chose that represent each one of those emotions. And again, this can be used at a very tactical level or at a very strategic level. So consumers also want unity and energetic change. So the shift between how they currently feel brands are communicating to them and what the ideal communication is to move away from controlling and skilled and move to friendly and social and stimulating. They want to pivot. They want to see an increased energy and the creating of change, but also that unity of that we're all in this together and we're allied. So looking at, we did a second part of the test, which was an implicit association test. And we fed in 30 different categories. And we had people sort them by villain and by hero. An implicit association test is a timed system 1 tool where we ask people to sort as quickly as possible. And we use the time component to be able to divide the system 1 and system 2 thought process into those 2 pieces. So we tend to pay attention to the implicit responses as they really are the gut instinctual responses, those responses that we tend to rely on for the majority of our decision making. And so heroes here help us get what we need. And we can see the list of heroes where the brands and the services that really delivered what we needed while we were under quarantine. Grocery stores, food delivery services, online stores, healthcare services. And when we looked at villains, villains restricted us and stressed us. So political organizations, cruise lines, federal government, mortgage companies, and the financial services companies and the travel companies are kind of interesting here. And that the financial services companies and looking at what's to come, right? So when we do come out of the emotional turmoil of coming out of quarantine, the next piece is going to be the economy. So we can see bubbling to the surface those financial services, as well as how is travel and the travel services going to be impacted? How are we going to adapt to that? And so they're falling more into the villain category. So if we look at the ideal brand signature, we can see that we want to not only increase the level of contentedness, but we want to focus on a well-being and momentum, that stimulation and that unitedness. And so can we pivot the brand message from the previous message around contentedness and cooperation to moving to one of increased change and showing momentum, but then also showing that we're that united and allied component. So hero brands successfully create feel-good loops. And we saw some examples with Walmart and Amazon has a new campaign going right now, which is also really leveraging this feel-good loop, that they're showing that the motivated, hardworking employees get the communities what they need. And the communities thank the employees, and the employers thank the employees. The hero of the story is the employees, not the brand. And this is critical when we see successful implementation of this, and both Walmart and Amazon have done a great job, is that the employee is the center of the story. And that even with the new Amazon campaign, the employee and the employee's safety is the center of the story. It's not about the brand. Why this matters. Memories are driven by emotions, and this is an emotional time. We do not recall experiences in a straightforward way. Instead, we remember our feelings more than the actual events as a whole. We remember how people and how brands make us feel, not necessarily what they say. And I tend to talk a little bit about 9/11 in this particular moment, is we look at an experience that was one day in time that had a huge impact. And for me, being in New York, I know exactly where I was. I know exactly what I was doing. I know exactly what I did, every component of that, because that memory is galvanized by that moment. And galvanizing events create memories because there are three main pathways to creating a memory. And primary is the emotion, place and location, story or narrative. And the COVID-19 pandemic is a culmination of these pathways. And we're more susceptible to long-term memory formation at this moment. Brands that are part of the story during this event have that opportunity to create long-term emotional connections with consumers, because we are in a moment of emotion. We do know where we are, what our place and location. We're going to be able to talk about, what happened. Where was I when we shut down, the states, or we shut down the government? And then what's the story around that? How did we adapt? What brands did we rely on? Which brands became critical to us during quarantine? Which brands become critical as we start to come out of quarantine? And all of these things leading to long-term behavioral changes. Our relationships with brands have changed. To mirror what Andrew talked about, we're in this state of change, and our relationship with brands have changed out of necessity. Consumers are trying new brands that they've never tried before. They're reprioritizing brands that have become more important. And there's a wealth of cognitive science that's proven out that behavioral change occurs in approximately the 60-day period. And we're well into that 60-day period. Habits and behaviors that we continue to day after day for a long period of time become new behaviors. And emotionally fueled behavioral changes during the pandemic are here to stay. And so your brand can either adapt and take advantage of how people want brands to communicate to them, or sit on the sidelines. And we do see some brands sitting on the sidelines. And as Andrew pointed out, you can adapt and embrace the change, or sit on the sidelines and wait for the impact. So how do you want to be remembered? Consumers will remember industries that were not genuine. There will be villains. Employees and customers must be the heroes of the story, not the brand. And your brand has the opportunity to connect emotionally at this point in time. Communicate a sense of well-being and positive momentum. Long-term emotional bonding is happening now, resulting in behavioral change. And using the System 1 tools, the ones that we've walked through, both visual semiotics and IAT, are ways to measure, engage how your brand is emotionally resonating with consumers. Because if we don't take into account the System 1 emotional path, that long-term brand building path, and we only focus on the System 2 rational path, we're missing a third of the equation. And I tend to liken it to looking through a keyhole into the room rather than opening the door. So the importance of understanding that emotional momentum, particularly at this period of time, is critical for brand development and growth. Thank you all. Not sure if we've got questions, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Todd and Andrew. Very, very well done. I'm super interested in what people have to say about this, but there is a couple, or some questions that came in. There's a couple that I wanted to cross over to you guys to see if you had a response to them. You mentioned that Todd, you mentioned that we're about 60 days into this period of change. So one of the questions that came up here was, are we too late? You know, are we too late to start now with System 1, System 1 tools in terms of where we are on this crisis, or is there something we can do to catch up?
No, I don't think we're too late, and I think you can see already from this data. You know, this was from the third week of April, and there's already been more of a shift. We could see just the change between how brands were already communicating and what the ideal was looking like, and you can see some brands already pivoting and shifting. I gave Amazon as an example, but you know, we're going to be within this to you know, as Andrew's data pointed out, the majority of people, 3/4 of people, believe that we're going to be in this for quite a while, and so there still is time, and using System 1 tools is going to give you that opportunity to, you know, seize the moment and continue to develop your brand.
Yeah, I'd echo that, saying that it's never too late. Things may have changed already and you can't go back and redo those, but getting a solid understanding of what's going on, it's never too late. It's always essential to stay on top of what's happening with your brand.
Yeah, and in doing that, we're tracking, right? And we're doing a lot of tracking studies right now, clearly. And Todd, you had shown some of the shifts, right? Like that snapshot we took in April, but we continue to do that. So, you know, how I assume that some of these heroes and billions are going to shift around, right, over time. Can you give some other examples of hero brands that are starting to do that, or maybe make that change, or even villains categories?
I think, from the data that there are no solid villains at this point, but there is definitely a grouping of industries and categories that have the villain tendency. So thinking about if I was in financial services at this point in time, and a financial services brand is, how do I emotionally connect with consumers, given that high propensity within the implicit association to be associated as a villain. The travel industry, for sure, how are they going to pivot and change in order to, embrace what is going to be the new normal? So I don't think, there are particular brands and categories that need to really be taken advantage of the moment. And I think, some of the obvious heroes have been the services that we've taken advantage. We've seen within fast food services, Uber, delivery services, online, again, Amazon and Walmart, getting us what we need at a critical time has really created a strong emotional bond.
Mm-hmm. Great. I don't know, Andrew, Grenville, if there are other questions you have. I have one follow-up I wanted to ask you guys.
I saw one come in that asked about the visual semiotics. Then it said on one of the slides you showed a picture with all sorts of words on it. Is that what the respondent sees, or do they just see the images?
They just see the images. Our visual semiotics is a true passive system one tool. We're extrapolating the emotions. They just see the images. That example was to show that, when you look at an image, it's a fall scene in New England. I always give the story. My wife and I were dropping off my middle son, and I may have positive emotions about that, and my wife certainly has negative emotions about that. But to show that each image carries both positive and emotional codes, and that we all look at images and have a different emotional reaction. So it's the collage collection and looking at not only the image, but the 6 structures within the image and how we arrive at the emotions.
Cool. Okay. Well, one last question that I had is a little bit more technology related and media related. Frankly, we've seen a tremendous amount of, I've seen at the top of your chart with the heroes, services, right? Partners, things that are being obviously delivered more to home. I'm wondering whether, Andrew or Todd, either one of you, what do you think about the rise of subscription in general? Being the platform is such an important part in the technology industry. We're not, tech companies aren't just selling hardware; they're selling, whole services and all, a broader array of things. Do you see, or do you think that the sort of rise of subscription engagement with consumers is going to increase based on what's been going on?
I think something like Netflix has become almost an essential service. This is like a new utility coming into your house, just like water and electricity. These are things that I think that people can't live without and are consuming in enormous quantities, and that's going to lay down a set of change that can never go back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would echo that and say, subscription services are, if they have not increased already, they will continue to increase, because as social distancing becomes part of the norm, and what is socializing going to be are you going to be delivering, having more, Uber Eats? Are you going to be having more food delivery services? Media and entertainment services, how we're going to consume those services is going to continue to increase. And I think to what Andrew said, they're going to become more essential than a luxury, or as a non-essential service.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So unless there are any other questions, we're at about 40 minutes, right on time. Andrew, any other questions you were getting, or are we good to wrap up?
No, I don't see any fresh ones here.
Okay, great. Well, I wanted to thank you guys for joining. A really, really educational, really informational. I appreciate all the time, and thanks everybody in the audience for joining. And we will see you on the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.